we're in right now. We'll talk a little bit about what a strategic plan is, what the components of that are, and then kind of go through the steps of building or updating one. And that's where we'll really have an opportunity to kind of do some working session time. And we'll talk about natural planning and how the process that normally your brain will just go through to plan anything that you decide to plan relates back to what we've talked about up to that point. And then, as Joey said, we'll try to answer some questions. But we have a relatively small group, so we can, I'll try to stop at various points along the way so that we can have some questions and make this a little more interactive. There will be periods throughout this. I know that everybody, is adapting to the virtual environment. There will be periods where I will not say much because I will ask you to take a minute and think through and maybe write out some notes to yourself about things that you might be thinking about. So if I go silent, it's because I'm giving you some quiet work time, not because I disappeared or fell into a virtual hang up void or something. So just a couple of housekeeping things there that might be useful. All right, so let's dive into this. Let's talk about planning and planning normally versus planning in turbulent times and things like that. So why plan? Well, the old adage that, a failure to plan is a plan to fail is really a pretty apt way to sort of set up why we plan, right? But really the real purpose of a strategic plan, particularly when you look at it in the organizational context, is to create a competitive advantage, right? A strategic plan is a series or pattern of actions that you or your company or your staff members or whomever undertake to try to create an advantage for yourself in the marketplace. And that advantage could be one where you beat out the competition. It can be one where you, build others up and benefit yourself at the same time. It could be a variety of different things. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. What I really want to hone in on as we get started here is normal planning versus planning in turbulent or difficult times. So most people will make a plan when they have time, right? It's a great kind of thing to do on a long free Friday afternoon or a Saturday morning sometimes. We sit back and sort of stare out the window like the one in front of me and just kind of take a couple of hours to really think through, well, what do I want to be true, and develop a plan about that. And that's great. The problem that I would argue is that most of the time, we're not in normal times. We tend to think that we are. Certainly, we're not in global pandemics most of the time, but we're not in the normal times that we sort of complacently think of ourselves as being in. And so more often than not, I think we are in dynamic environments. And when we're in dynamic environments, we have a tendency to be reactive. And that's probably one of the worst things we can do. Because the people who stop and zoom out and actually develop a plan and kind of figure out, okay, the world has changed. Where are we and what do we need to be doing to respond to how it's changed are the people that are going to make the most of crisis situations. The people or the organizations that just sort of go, we're in a crisis, we must react to whatever the crisis is, are the ones that are probably not going to come through with the same level of satisfaction or positive results at the end. It doesn't mean that you'll have negative results. It's just not necessarily going to increase the chances of that. And so I would argue that one of the times that people are most likely to not plan is during a crisis situation. And while crises do provide clarity because they sort of strip away the non-essential and help you focus, when uncertainty is prevalent, that's really probably the most important time to stop, take a step back, and zoom out. I actually had this conversation with a colleague just this morning. And we were just talking about how, it's so easy in these times to rush into responding to questions when in reality, a lot of times what we need to do is stop and say, hang on, can we make sure we're on the same page? We're working from the same context. We're reading off the same song sheet, if you will. And if that's the case, then we can start to really have a more thorough conversation about working through whatever is in front of us. So hopefully that kind of gives you a little bit of context of how I'm approaching this idea of planning and strategic planning right now in today's world and environment. And by the way, I'm applying very much of what I'm presenting to you to my team and our efforts to retain and re-enroll students at Lamar University right now. So I'm not telling you to do anything that I'm not practicing on a daily basis as best I can. I also get tied up in, oh my gosh, the sky's falling, we must respond right now. So don't think that I think I'm perfect. So let's talk about a strategic plan for a second. So what is a strategic plan? I mentioned that it's a pattern of actions that's really aimed at securing or creating a competitive advantage. And this competitive advantage is some way to make yourself or your business more successful in the marketplace, in the industry, in the community, whatever your sort of arena that you want to be working in, make it more successful than others. And that can be a zero-sum game, or it can be a win-win type of game. I don't think it really matters, and I don't want to belabor this or spend too much time on it because this is really not where the meat is. Um, but another way that I like to describe a strategic plan always, Bill's probably heard me say this a million times, is that it's a to-do list. It's a to-do list for the organization. It's a to-do list that tells us what tasks we have to do, by whom, by when, to fulfill the mission, the reason that our organization exists. And so this is kind of a basic working definition to give you a frame of reference for kind of the rest of the morning on what a strategic plan is and what we're kind of looking at here. So let's dive into some of these components of this plan a little bit more. A strategic plan always has to start with the mission, right? Who are we? What are we trying to do? That's what the mission should answer. And that's all the mission should answer. A lot of people try to throw a lot of things into mission statements. You end up with these, half-page long mission statements that really tell you nothing because people haven't stopped long enough to really kind of clarify the answer to the question, who are we and what do we do? And so on the handout, kind of looking at that, I've given a couple of questions for consideration. And in just a second, I'm going to stop and let you kind of take a minute to think about these questions. But the first one kind of asks, what is the advantage that you're after? What is the competitive advantage that you want to be true for your business or yourself in the marketplace? And then the next question kind of asks, what's going on with your mission? Is it updated? Is it current? Is it accurate? Does it really describe who we are and what we do? And then the next component of this is the vision, the visionary or aspirational aspect. And this is the who you want to be. And yeah, you could combine these things into a mission statement, but as we go on, I think it'll probably be a little bit clearer why I see these two things as separate. That mission is a fundamental thing. It probably is not going to change much through the entire existence of your company, however long that existence is. That vision statement could change every 2 or 3 years, depending on how the world changes around you. And separating those two things out to kind of have that core statement of who we are and what we do, what we value, how we operate, from who we want to be given the environment today, I find that to be a really helpful thing. It provides some clarity because you always have the anchor of the mission to come back to, regardless of however the world changes around you. So hopefully that helps clarify those two things. So I don't really see the mission as being aspirational in nature. I don't see it changing frequently, whereas the vision can change a lot more frequently to respond to new environmental conditions. The next component here is goals and objectives. And so I have a little bit of a different approach to goals and objectives in my mind than most people do. For me, goals are real high level. They could be kind of fuzzy and nebulous, and that's why I always kind of try to include the term objectives, because a lot of people think of goals as being very specific, very focused things. To me, goals and objectives are essentially interchangeable, and I think of them as something that is again very high level. So if you take the analogy of football, right? Uh, Goals and objectives to me are win the game type of level stuff, not score a touchdown or run a certain set of plays or get a first down or something like that type level stuff, right? So we're way up at the top, fuzzy, kind of nebulous, not necessarily as specific as we might normally think at this point, okay? And so again, I've got on that handout kind of a differentiation between win the game type goals and objectives versus score the touchdown type goals and objectives. Before we come back to the handout and really work through some of those things that I've just mentioned on there, let me kind of finish the component piece of the strategic plan here. So the next level is sort of strategies. I think you can sort of group tactics together here and think of these two things as kind of being one and the same. They could almost be combined on this slide as opposed to separate. The strategies are the series of actions that you're going to take to achieve those goals. So they're the scoring the touchdowns or getting the first down that moves you closer to the goal line. And you may have some timelines here. You might have some high level departmental responsibilities in a highly sort of departmentalized organization. but it's still not quite down at that action level yet at the strategy level. The tactics are really those next actions, right? The specific actions that specific people need to take by a certain deadline. You're going to measure their performance on that, and you can think of this in the football analogy as the specific plays we're going to run, right? A series of plays that you're going to run while the play clock's counting down. You're deciding what you're going to do right now, and so you want to outline that series of sort of plays. Again, I hope you can kind of see that there's a little bit of gray between tactics and strategies, and that's why I say that they almost belong sort of together. But there's enough to make a little bit of a differentiation there. And the final component here is, of course, going to be your metrics. You've got to have some way to measure whether or not you're actually making progress on scoring touchdowns, winning the game. And so you need to have some performance measures. And these can take on a variety of formats. They could be specific targets that you want to hit. They could be specific targets along specific points in time. They could be timelines for completing certain things. This is where you can get into, if you're in that world, project plans, Gantt charts, flow charts, and all those kinds of things. Responsible parties, what are the outcomes we're after, those kinds of things. That's what we're looking at with the metrics level. So let me stop for a second. The first thing that I'll ask is, are there any questions? And the second thing is, once we deal with that, I'll give you a couple of minutes to go back over those first few questions on the handout and kind of take a moment to answer for yourself. So any questions about anything we've talked about so far? Okay, hearing none, I'm gonna give you a couple of minutes. Yeah, we'll take about 2 minutes and let you kind of just look through those first few questions. Think about them in the context of whatever you're bringing to this discussion this morning. So, are you thinking about your organization? Are you thinking about you personally, your own career or future aspirations? Are you thinking about some organization that you're involved with tangentially as a board member or something like that? And so, kind of take maybe 2 minutes or so and look back through those two questions. And this is a moment where I'm going to go silent intentionally. Okay, that's about 2 minutes. So for the sake of time, I'm going to keep going. Feel free to tune me out and keep working if you're on a roll. That is always something that I will encourage you to do. If you feel like you're getting it and you're on a roll and you really want to keep going down a creative path, then by all means, please do so. You can come back and watch me later, or the, the value that I'm adding is probably not as good as being on that roll yourself. So if we're being honest. Okay, so let's go on, and now we're really going to get into kind of the meat and do more of the working session. So we'll kind of stop and start periodically for the next few minutes while we go through some of these components. So I'm going to ask you to kind of zoom out and step out of your organization or yourself or whatever however you're approaching this webinar this morning, and kind of look at what's going on around you for a few minutes. That's what we're going to do next. And by the way, let me go back for just 1 second and say a hat tip to my fabulous student assistant who just graduated with her Master's of Science in Accounting. be starting a CPA job in the fall over in Houston, and has already passed with almost a perfect score, the first of the four components of the CPA exam. She gave me a tremendous value by helping me create these slides so that I could work on other things. So hat tip to Kinder, and I will miss her very much. She's been just a tremendous student all the way back to when she was in my class. So even though she's not here, hat tip to her. So again, this is what we were just kind of looking at and talking through here. I just want to make one comment real quick about the refining the vision, right, and working on the vision. So I think a lot of times one of the things that we sort of have a question about with strategic planning is, what's the timeline for a strategic plan? You'll hear a lot of people that want to make a 3-year plan or a 5-year plan or something like that for the organization. There's nothing wrong with that. I like the idea of sort of an evergreen or a perennial or ongoing strategic plan, something that is constantly present that you come back and evaluate, on some regular frequency or some regular basis, and sort of say to yourself, okay, what has changed in the world and what does that change in this plan? But the plan is going to be a living, breathing organism that keeps going on forever, and that we don't say, okay, in 5 years, this stuff is going to be true, and then we're going to put it on a shelf and make a new one and never come back to it again. That to me is more or less just satisfying your desire to have a plan, whereas something that you look at with regular frequency and update on a regular basis seems to me to be a little bit more serious about really trying to implement and act on those things. That's a personal preference. Your mileage may vary, and you don't have to do what I say. Well, you have to do what I say, period, but you don't have to do what I say in the context of strategic planning. For goals and objectives, the question that I would ask, see, the first 3 steps that we always want to do, right? Evaluate the mission, evaluate the vision. If you don't have them, create them, right? And then outline the goals and objectives that sort of flow out of that mission and that vision. I have this question here, why now, right? Why create goals and objectives at this point in the process is essentially what I'm asking. Don't you need to do some analysis of what's going on in the environment first? No. Let me just not sugarcoat that, right? Your goals and objectives, should be driven by your mission and your vision. Who are you and who do you want to be should tell you and dictate for you what the goals that you need to achieve to make that possible are. We're going to come back and refine that in the context of the environment that you find yourself in, but you want that core established for yourself. And so I think that these 3 steps have to happen first before you start doing any kind of external analysis of what's going on around you. Really knowing who you are and how you're going to try to fulfill who you are is kind of that first step. So those are kind of the first 3 steps in the process. So let's go into a little more detail of what happens next. So the next thing you really want to do is look at what's going on in the environment around you. And so we're going to start with kind of an external analysis. So we'll use the context of a company here, right? But you may be, again, looking at this from your own perspective, you personally. So if you're using the context of a company, we want to look at 2 levels of analysis of what's going on in the environment outside of your company. The first is the broad sort of macro level environment, right? And we call this PEST. Or a PEST analysis, which is essentially looking at what's going on in the political, economic, social, and technological realms relative to your company and the sort of globe at large. Then we want to zoom into the micro level and really look at what's going on in our particular industry or our particular community or whatever may be the case. One of the challenges that I've kind of run into over the years of doing consulting work for strategic planning in Southeast Texas is that we don't have a lot of multi-company industries in Southeast Texas, if you kind of know what I mean, right? We have a lot of businesses where they're kind of the only business that's really serious or that anybody's really thinking about going to do business with in that industry in our community. So if you're in a city like Houston or Austin or Dallas, you've got tons and tons of firms and companies that are the involved in one industry. And so kind of understanding what's going on at that industry level is not necessarily something we always have to spend a lot of time with in Southeast Texas. It depends on the reach of your business and who your competitors are and that kind of thing. So your mileage may vary with some of this, but it's still a good thing to kind of look through. So let's take these apart in a little more detail. And this is where I'm going to kind of start and stop a little bit so that you can kind of think about some of these things. So I would ask you the question, and I would ask you to stop for a second as we, particularly as we look at the macro level here, I would ask that we not spend that you not adopt a frame of reference that's only based on coronavirus, right? It's very easy to say, we're in coronavirus mindset right now, and I've got to respond and react to that type of situation. But the whole point of this discussion, right, is to get us to zoom out a little bit and say, let's not just respond and react to crisis. Let's think through what's going to happen next. And if we think of this as a big one, but as still just a blip in the grand scheme of things, what does that really look like in terms of how we factor that into our planning and decision making? So I would ask you to think back to sort of pre-March mindset a little bit and think ahead to, I'm picking a date because we obviously don't know yet, but let's say to, October type mindset, right? When hopefully things will be back to some semblance of normal for us. And so if you adopt that mindset and still keep the coronavirus frame of reference, what's going on relative to your industry in the political environment right now? And the political environment question can also include legal and regulatory questions, right? If those are relevant to you. So I'd ask you to take just a second, and we'll just do, 15, 30-second stop and starts here. And kind of think through what major political or regulatory or legal issues are jumping to mind for you and your company and your industry right this minute. And then you can probably figure out where this is going, right? So the next question will be what's going on in terms of in terms of the economic situation. Again, in the industry, again, broader, you want to look at it largely in ways that are going to affect you, right? No real reason to think about political or economic consequences that don't really have any concern for you or your company. Okay, so the next one is obviously social trends or patterns. What we're really looking at here, you can think of in terms of what's going on with customer preferences at large in the marketplace. What's going on with demographic trends? What's going on with socioeconomic kind of trends? A little bit of an overlap between those two categories. What are you seeing in terms of changing demands, changing makeup of the marketplace and the people in it, and how that relates to your company or you yourself? So that's the social trends one. And then the last one looks at the technological environment. What's going on with technology that could affect your business? And that could be a variety of different things. Technology that's going to create opportunities for your business, technology that's going to make things easier and better for you. Um, it can also be technology that's a threat, right? That is going to be a challenge that could replace parts of your business, that could replace your business. It's a scary thought, but it's a reality that some of us have to think about depending on the industry that we're in. That's this is a major challenge that I'm looking at every day, right? How does how does the enrollment makeup of a university shift if people realize that online education just got a major acceleration, right, over the last few months. And again, we're seeing a lot of students that are saying, I don't like this, I still like being in the classroom learning. But there's plenty of people that are going to go, cool, I've started to learn to adapt to this virtual environment, and what else can I do in a virtual environment as I move forward with my life? So again, thinking about those things in terms of opportunities and threats there. All right, so that's the macro level. Let's go down to the micro level. So we're going to come in again to the industry focus, the community focus, the personal network focus, whatever is the appropriate application of this for you. So there's a fantastic Harvard business professor, Michael Porter, who really has done a lot of work on strategy and particularly competitive advantage in the marketplace. And Michael Porter years ago developed this framework of analyzing your industry or your sort of micro environment that he calls the five forces of competition. And they're, often referred to as Porter's five forces. You can see them on the slide here. So let me take you through these real quick. I've indicated only four in the bullets. That's because I've combined two into one bullet, because you kind of have to think of those as kind of being the same thing. But it starts kind of at the top by looking at, well, really, it starts kind of at the upper left if you're looking at the slide down here. Can you see my pointer? Okay, good. So it starts over here, right? And what it starts with is looking at what's going on. We call this sort of intensity or competition or degree of rivalry in the industry as it is. So this is where you would kind of evaluate who are my competitors, and how tight is that competition, right? Is there a clear leader in the industry or in the community in this particular area? Or are there a lot of people that are really competing for market share, and it's a really lot of intense competition? So understanding how those competitive forces are sort of currently working is the first step that we have to understand. The next element then is to look at, okay, so given that, how strong the current competition is, right? What is the likelihood that somebody that's not in this industry or not in this community or not in this particular area could come in? What are the barriers or lack of barriers to entry, right? So what I always like to, when I teach strategy at Lamar, what I always like to talk about when we talk about threat of new entrants is I like to use the analogy of something like Microsoft Office, right? And you kind of have to back up like 5 years, because we've seen some of this kind of change in the last 5 years with mobile. But if you go back, say, just 5 years ago, right? Was there a good chance that, or was there a high likelihood that some brand new software company was going to come in and take away significant market share in the sort of Office software suite product space from Microsoft? No, right? I mean, 99.9% of professionals on earth today are using Word, Excel, and PowerPoint for most of their computing needs as far as office productivity goes, right? So the chance that somebody new was going to come in and really take away significant market share from Microsoft was pretty low. So what that means, translating that to Porter's five forces here, is it means that the threat of new entrants in that industry was pretty low. It's changed a bit, right? Because people are using mobile solutions a lot now, and there are a lot of other things that have been a little more mobile friendly over the last few years than Microsoft Office. Office is catching up now. But it was a little slow go for them, right? Especially in the early days of iPhone and iPad, there really wasn't, much in terms of Office productivity suite at that time. So you're seeing some changes there, and that's something where you're seeing Microsoft start to adapt by shifting more to this mobile-first, cloud-based strategy. And they're, kudos to them for adapting and figuring it out. That's a great example of strategic planning, right? Looking at the environment and what's going on, and then adapting your plan to that. So then the next thing we want to do that you can kind of take together is this idea of looking at suppliers and buyers together, right? And so the question is always, in your industry, if you take all the companies in the industry, right? Not just yours. If you take all the companies in the industry and look at their relationship with buyers or customers or consumers in the industry, who has the bargaining power? Who has the leverage, in other words, to say, it's gonna be made this way, or the service is gonna be provided this way? Is it the buyers or is it the companies? And that depends, right? And so you've got to figure out, for your industry, for your business, do I have the say in sort of how a product or service is going to be made and delivered, or do the customers? And let's get the customer is always right argument out of the way. That's a customer service thing, right? That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about fundamentally how you build and deliver your products or services. Are you dictating and deciding the direction of how you're doing that? Or is that really driven by customers and customer demands? That's the question to ask here. We need to ask the same questions about any suppliers. So anybody that provides any resources to us that become inputs into our product development or service delivery, who has the negotiating leverage in that relationship? Is it us as the company or the industry, or is it the suppliers to that industry? This is why you're seeing, if you're a technology fan or fanatic like me, you're seeing that there have been rumors for about 2 or 3 years now that Apple is going to eventually start making computers, not well, I guess all their products are computers, but specifically PCs, right? MacBooks, iMacs, those kinds of things, with their own Apple produced processors, right? Because right now, Apple produced processors are in iPhones and iPads, and they're outperforming, they're really quite bluntly kicking Intel's butt, right? On processor power and battery use and those kinds of things. But right now, they're still dependent on Intel for those processor chips for the PCs. And there's been rumors that Apple is working on, a Mac that is driven by an Apple made processor. This is what we're talking about here right now, right? Apple is dependent on Intel for those chips for their computers, meaning that in the bargaining power of suppliers relationship, Intel has the negotiating leverage. And Apple is stuck on this schedule of waiting for Intel to update chips to keep up with whatever kind of processor demands and needs Apple's computers have. The faster Apple can cut its dependence on Intel and begin to produce its own chips, which they're showing us in their mobile devices are kicking Intel's butts, the easier they're going to have the bargaining power, right? They're going to have the negotiating power, the leverage in that relationship with suppliers, because they're going to be able to update their computers whenever they want to. So that's, again, those relationships, bargaining power of buyers, bargaining power of suppliers. The last thing you want to look at is substitutes and complements. So the question here is, what other products or services exist that, in the case of substitutes, that a customer could buy and use in place of ours? So here's a great example of a way to think of substitute products. So we're not talking about, okay, I could, if we go to Southeast Texas, right? I could have, if I need funeral services, I could go to Broussard's, or I could go to Clay Bar or something like that, right? That's not what we're talking about. That's providing the same service. What I'm talking about is, say, I take my dress shirts and get them dry cleaned at the local cleaners, right? But I decide that I'm not going to go with doing that anymore. I'm just going to wash and iron them at home. That's a substitute, right? Instead of going to the cleaners now, the cleaners has lost my business as a customer, and instead I'm just going to wash my shirts in my own washer and dryer and then iron them myself, right? So that's an example of substitutes. The other piece is, what products are complementary products? So what things are out there that could enhance things that you make and provide, that could be opportunities for synergy and joint ventures and other things like that, right? So of course, great examples of that are things like shampoo and conditioner, right? Something that you can see I spend a lot of time using. Or toothpaste and toothbrush and things like that, right? And so those are really simple and kind of silly examples, because obviously most of the companies that make shampoo also make conditioner and so on and so forth, right? But looking around and sort of saying, what's a complementary product or service to mine that could create some synergistic opportunities in my industry or my company? So that's kind of a quick look at the macro and micro levels of sort of doing an external analysis. So I'm going to go on for the sake of time, but you can kind of work through that, later if you want to work through some of those questions for yourself if you haven't been working through them now. The last question that I have on the handout as part of external analysis is an important one. How does what you've identified affect your mission, vision, and goals, right? So you've established a mission, a vision, and a set of goals to try to achieve that vision and fulfill that mission, right? But now that you've started doing this external analysis, are those things still accurate, relevant, and on point? And if not, then you might need to go back and take a look at them again, okay? Now let's shift the focus to internal analysis. So we need to also look at what the current state of or status of our company is, right? And so to do that, we really want to look at four main things. The first one, or first two, which are usually taken together, are resources and capabilities, right? So resources, and this is a simple analysis or inventory of what resources does your company or do you as an individual have? So you could look at, from the company perspective, right? What are my human resources? Who are my people, right? What are our intellectual resources? And that can be things like patents and things like that, but it can also be things like, what is the collective knowledge and wisdom that my team, my actual people, human resources, bring to the table? What are your financial resources? Do you have a lot of debt? Do you have a lot of cash sitting around? And those kinds of things. I thought, by the way, this is a compliment to the awesome chamber staff. I thought that one of the most fascinating things from the results of our sort of climate survey that we did at the beginning of this coronavirus situation, I thought one of the most fascinating questions or set of answers was the one about how long you could operate your or keep your business open with sort of remote operations or even suspended operations and those kinds of things. The various responses to that were fascinating to me. That gives you a sense of how leveraged companies are. And it was interesting to see that from a high level perspective in our community. So I really enjoyed looking through those results and looking at that one in particular. But that's what we're looking at here, right? What resources do you have? What technology, what manufacturing, what processes does your company have? On the personal level, what skills do you have? What knowledge do you bring to the table? What experience? Those kinds of things, right? And then we want to look at capabilities. And this is just what you can do, right? What is our company able to do that no one else is, or that is unique to us and that might create some value in the marketplace? And then other things to look at are things like your structure. How is your company currently set up? What does the org chart look like? Does that make sense? Is it serving your mission and vision well? And those kinds of things. Are you missing positions? Are you missing entire divisions or departments, depending on the size of the company? Those are questions to ask. And then, of course, you want to have the culture conversation, which a lot of people don't want to have because it seems touchy-feely, right? But the culture conversation is really important because this is the conversation that really lets you look at how you're leveraging your people. Those human resources are really so essential, and we have to stop every so often and say, you know, am I killing my people? Am I demanding too much? Am I not demanding enough? What's the current climate and environment like? You know, do they feel appreciated, and those kinds of things? And so you've got to kind of ask yourself those questions. And then, of course, not surprisingly, you want to come back and sort of take this all as a whole and look at it and say, are all of these things internally set up to really support our mission and our vision? And if not, what changes do we need to make? And those could be changes to the things in the internal analysis, or they could be changes to align your mission and vision more to what is actually happening in practice. You know, somewhere in here, you probably need to do a values assessment also, right? And kind of look through what are our values, our core key values as a company. You know, that could fit in a variety of different places, but it's probably something that you want to take a look at some point in here. The results of those external and internal analysis give you something that's probably the number one thing that most people know about when you talk about a strategic plan, which is your SWOT. We call this a SWOT analysis, right? So those internal analysis results tell you what your strengths and weaknesses are. And those external results tell you what the opportunities and threats in the marketplace are. And so those are really, you want to summarize all that stuff and look at it together. You really want to try to maximize your strengths, and where you can, you want to try to match your strengths to opportunities in the marketplace. That's a really well-designed strategic plan right there, is one that finds the strengths of the resources and capabilities of the company and matches those to needs and opportunities in the marketplace. That's going to work really well. You want to try to correct for, or at least mitigate your weaknesses, the internal weaknesses, and you want to also then look at ways to guard against external threats. So Joey was asking me when we started today about some of the recent announcements from Lamar University about how we're responding from a restructuring perspective, financial perspective, to the coronavirus situation. And you know, we've been, I know at least in the division that I'm in, we've been very proactive of working with the CFO of the university to really think through, you know, proactively, how are we going to guard against some of the financial threats that could be coming? Of course, we're working every day in the enrollment space, so we're looking at those numbers year over year, every single day. But we're able to sort of plan ahead and think about those things and really try to diminish the impact that those threats can have on us and on the university as a whole. So doing that regularly is a really important thing. How often should you do these analyses? The best answer is as often as something changes. The better answer is probably, or the you know, sort of second best answer is, you know, probably at least on an annual basis, kind of reevaluating what's going on with external and internal environments. And of course, always you want to come back and keep refining those goals and objectives to make sure that they're not only focused on your mission and vision, but also taking into consideration what's going on in the environment. From there, you get down into the granular level, right? So we go to strategies, we go to tactics. So given everything that we found in the external environment, what are the specific action items that we need to sort of put into place, um, and and how are we going to implement those? That's your implementation plan. And how are we going to measure performance on those? And these things are usually pretty clear, right? When you get that high level in place, it's pretty easy after that to go, oh, okay, we need to do X, Y, and Z. And it makes the most sense for Joe over here to be responsible for X, and Jenny over here to be responsible for Z, and that kind of stuff. And here's a reasonable timeline and that kind of stuff. And then you roll the plan out and put it in place and monitor performance and course correct as you go along. Course correct as you go along. A quick comment about that. So anybody that's familiar with sort of the program planning approach, which is more of that scientific method type approach, right? Where you identify a problem, you have a hypothesis, and then you put a plan into place, let that plan play out, and then assess what happened and come back and adjust as necessary. It's not the way strategic planning works, right? Strategic planning is supposed to be something that allows you to course correct in the middle, right? In the process. And that's purposeful and is important, because what you want to be able to do is monitor performance on an ongoing basis and say, this is not working, right? Before we spend a bunch of resources down a path that ain't working for us, let's take a step back and figure out whether or not we're even on the right path, right? And so this is a great point to kind of come back to that analogy of strategic plan being the organizational to-do list, right? Because everybody on this webinar, I'm sure, has a personal to-do list. I certainly do, right? I wish mine were a little shorter these days, but whatever. Okay, and you probably all feel the same way. That personal to-do list is a living, breathing document, right? Uh, and we would all love to get off this webinar and find that one thing on that to-do list got done without us having to do it. Wouldn't that be fantastic, right? It'd be wonderful, but it changes your to-do list. And the funny thing about human nature, this is a real funny thing, and it's true for organizations because they're just collections of people, right? The funny thing about people is the faster you check a bunch of stuff off your to-do list, the faster you free up all kind of creative mental energy to go create a whole bunch of other crap that you need to do, right? And so what happens on those glorious Friday afternoons where you've checked a bunch of stuff off during the week, and the creative visionary in you dreams up all these fantastic things that you're going to do next week, right? Puts them all on a to-do list on Friday afternoon, goes and has a fantastic weekend, comes back on Monday and goes, what the heck was this person thinking last week, right? And that's exactly what happens at the organizational level too. So this constant approach to adapting and course correcting is really critically important for a strategic plan, at least in my opinion. And it's just because, like I said, I think of it in terms of a to-do list. Let me stop for a second. Are there questions at this point? Are people even still awake? I'm just kidding. Okay, all right. So thank you. So I'm going to go on here and let's put this in the context of how we as humans sort of naturally plan things. Fundamentally, everything that we do planning is about outcome and action, right? These are like, if you're a coding person, these are the zeros and ones of productivity, of effectiveness, right? Is defining what is it that I want to be true as an outcome, and what is the next series of actions that's going to get me closer to that outcome. That's how you win a football game. That's how you get a competitive advantage in the marketplace. That's how you get a new job. It's also how you decide, when you're able to do so, where to go to dinner. It's how you decide what to put on a grocery list. It's how you decide what to wear in the morning, and so on and so forth, right? We all go through this process of saying, what do I want to be true? And what do I need to do in terms of reallocation of physical and other resources to make that true, right? So if that's the fundamental operating perspective, right, the same thing is true for strategic plan. All we're trying to determine is, for our organization, what do we want to be true? And what's the series of actions that's going to get us closer to probably making that true? This is what football teams do, right? What do we want to be true? We want to win the game, right? What do we have to do that? We have to score more points than the opposing team, right? How do we do that? Well, we run this series of plays, and we're going to adapt that series of plays based on what we see is actually happening during the game, right? And that's how we practice. So it's the same concept. So what's this normal process? Let's say that you get up tomorrow morning and you just want to decide what to wear. And since, some of us are going into an office and some of us are not, this is a varied decision for people at this point in time. So bear with me because most of my examples that I normally use will be a bit belabored thanks to coronavirus. Um, so, so you are trying to decide, what do I want to wear today, right? All right, great. So question one is purpose and principles, right? And this is always where you will start in your brain planning this whole thing. Well, what do I have to do today? Am I going to see anybody? Am I going to go anywhere? How fancy do I have to look for those people that I'm going to see, right? So this is the very first thing that you're going to ask yourself is the purpose question. Why do I want to decide what to wear, right? And then the next question that you're going to sort of consider for yourself is the principles question or the rules. How are we going to play? What are the rules of the game? That's the question that you're going to ask yourself at that point. And that's a really interesting kind of question also because well, it's a particularly interesting question, the analogy that I've just given you, because there's some interesting things that people decide to wear, right? All the time, even in normal circumstances. And it's kind of like, they have a different set of criteria for determining what's an appropriate thing to wear than I do. And that's a sort of humorous analogy, but you can see how the principles thing comes into play at that point, right? So purpose and principles is where it's always going to start. If you're trying to decide what to fix for dinner, the first question you're always going to ask is, why do I want to eat, right? And then the second question you're going to ask is, well, what kinds of things would be reasonable things for me to eat, right? So unless you went to A&M, you're probably not going to go scrape up roadkill and use that as something that's acceptable for dinner, right? Okay, so Aggie jokes. Okay, so the next question you're going to ask yourself is, and you cannot stop yourself from doing this, it's the way the brain works, right? You're going to ask yourself these questions of, well, what would wild success look like? You're probably not going to ask yourself what wild success would look like on getting dressed in the morning, right? That's probably not the kind of place that you're going to look at that. But it is still, sorry, I didn't mean to click the slide ahead. That is still a question that you're going to ask yourself at some point in this process is, what would wild success look like? That's that vision piece. Then naturally, you're going to start thinking of all the possible things that could contribute to wild success on whatever this is, right? And this for getting dressed is going to be, well, what could I wear? Well, let's see. We're going to eliminate sorry, scratch that last comment. You're going to start thinking through, well, I could wear this, could wear that, right? And all the kinds of options. You probably stand there in front of your closet and think about this. Okay. And then you'll start to go through the process of elimination. This is the organized piece. This is where you get sort of left brain and really functional about, okay, let's clean this up. And so that's when you're going to do things like, well, look, it's already summer in Southeast Texas because it's, May here. And so probably not going to wear parkas and overcoats and things like that, right? So we can eliminate those things from consideration. It does tend to be cool wherever I work. So maybe I do want to bring, something light that I can put on there. We get very operational in nature, organizing those things. And then the last thing you're going to do every time is, pick something out and put it on, right? Act. And so this is the simple process that your brain goes through with every single decision that you make every single day. By the way, this is why you're all exhausted at the end of the day every day, especially if you make a lot of decisions, right? And then a kid or a spouse or somebody wants to know, what are we going to eat? And it's like, I don't know and I don't care. My decision making is done. And so this is exactly what we're going to go through. Guess what this looks exactly like, right? A strategic plan, right? And so that's all strategic planning is based on, right? Starting at this high level of outcomes and actions. Purpose, here's your mission. Principles, there's your values. Vision, that's obvious. Brainstorm, what are all the possible things we could do to make the vision true? Organize, well, let's get some criteria to figure out which ones of those we want to do and in what order and in what priority and based on what in the environment, and then take action. And so fundamentally, it comes down to this. I do love this quote, right? It's just a fantastic quote. A vision, and it's just from the walls of a church in England from the 18th century. A vision without a task is but a dream. A task without a vision is drudgery. A vision and a task is the hope of the world. And when you look at this, it's so simple, right? If you have this vision, but you're not going to take any action on it, you're just dreaming. If all you're doing is just working on stuff, but you never actually focus on anything, any type of outcome, you're just banging your head against the wall every single day. But when you combine those two things, an outcome and a next action, that's where you can actually do something that might move the world forward in a meaningful way, either for you or for others as well. And fundamentally, that's all that planning and strategic planning is about. The challenge is to stop ourselves and slow ourselves down in crisis situations and really stop and say, what is the outcome and what is the action that I'm after, and take that step back. Cool. That's all that's on my list. I'm happy to answer questions or whatever else you all would like to do with 5 or so more minutes.
A lot of great information, Craig, and especially the last part. You're talking about everybody having perhaps a little more time in the last few months, and maybe a little bit of time moving forward. You hear a lot of talk about improving yourself. Do something every day, whether it's read an additional book, or maybe you're working out an extra 30 minutes, or whatever those things are, to come up with a goal to better yourself during this time. It's the least you could do. I think this is probably the most profound thing that you would be able to do if you have a couple extra minutes. And I think it's perfect timing for this webinar.
Well, thanks for that. I think, I kind of hinted at, you could be looking at this for your company or your organization or for yourself throughout. I think there's a lot of people who this pause has given them. I certainly am hearing this from people that I interact with regularly. This pause has given them a chance to actually stop and really reevaluate where their time, their commitments were going in their lives. I know a lot of people are getting to spend a lot more time with their families. They are doing things like working out more and other things like that. And I really wouldn't be, it's not the best time to be looking for a job right now, but I would not be surprised if once things settle down, if we see some people who kind of go, I don't think I want to do what I was doing anymore. I'm going to go down a different path. And so I think sometimes we think of this planning thing as having to be in the context of an organization, but we could all use that time to stop and kind of look at it for ourselves. And one of the things that I'm trying to learn to incorporate into my own life is a little more time to just kind of capture random thoughts that come into my head, right? Because a lot of times having those things to go back and look back on them later, you can make some really cool connections and come up with some really cool ideas and other things that you can do. So even just that is something that could be a good takeaway, from this discussion.
Agreed. Anybody have any questions or thoughts?
Well, I've come to the conclusion that I must be in the dreaming stages because my thoughts and ideas of what I wanted to do, and I do plan on doing this. I actually do have some investors for my project that I'd like to create and build up one day. But my goal was to have like a senior living, a veterans location, a daycare for not just infants, but for preschool kids, I guess, if you will, and then an adult daycare. And at one point in time, I had thought about using, when Baptist Orange closed down, using that hospital, but they say that needs so much work that to get it up to code that it wouldn't be worth even going that route. So I kind of threw that on the back burner after that. But I do have some investors out of Houston, and they're the ones that suggested to build up instead of wide. And because of all the things that I want to put into it. And then, of course, my investor threw in some extra things that I never really thought about putting into it, but I thought that's a great idea. I can do that. I can make this work. So, but I'm still, this was good information for planning, because I definitely have a lot of planning to do. I do have some key people that I want to put in place, but I just haven't followed through with it. So I need to get busy if I want to do something different with it.
Well, that's great. There may be some key people that are looking for an opportunity here in the next few months also. So
Yes, for sure.
that may be a good thing for you. No, that's great. I'm glad that this was helpful. And the great thing about this is you can start sort of anywhere, right? You really, I presented it in sort of a big picture down to the granular level approach, but you can start anywhere. If you want to start with analyzing the environment, you can do that. If you want to start with just, hey, what can I make out of this series of actions that just seems to make logical sense to me, and I want to back up and kind of retrofit kind of who we are and what we do to that. You can start anywhere in the process. And I think sometimes the fact that people don't know where to start with the mission and the vision gives them sort of paralysis, right? And then they just procrastinate and don't ever move on it. And some of the best stuff starts because you start somewhere in the middle of the process, right?
Right.
The analogy that I always use with my students is to point out to them that despite the fact that we have these wonderful word processing tools, software tools available to us today, most human beings do not use them correctly, right? The purpose of Word should be that you just go in and dump everything down and then come back and reorganize, copy, paste, move around, edit, delete, add to later, right? But that's not what we do. What do we all do? We start typing and then backspace, 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 right? That's not what I meant to say there, right? We edit as we go, and that's such not the right way to use the tool, and just not the way that the brain works. So start anywhere in the process, wherever it speaks to you. And even if it's just collecting a bunch of random ideas that are dreams, eventually, you know, there may be enough clarity of how to move forward. I tell my staff that all the time, right? My staff comes to me and they've got some problem, and it's like, what are we supposed to do here? How do we solve this? And I go, I don't know. I don't have enough information to make a decision on that. Do we need to make a decision today? No? Okay, well, then let's wait a little longer and maybe it'll be clearer. Worst case scenario, we're no better off than we are right now. We just wait a little longer to make the decision. But, you know, there's a lot of decisions that we were going to make in February that aren't relevant anymore.
Well, it's really good, Craig, and I sure appreciate everybody being on. Thank you so much for your time, and that was a great bit of information. I think everybody's going to walk away feeling motivated and feeling a new focus. Really, really good stuff. This meeting has been recorded. We are going to put it on our website soon, so you'll be able to revisit it. I'll email it, the link to it to everybody who is participating today, so you can go back through and you can revisit some of the ideas and kind of help maybe through your thought process as you're developing your plan. We have one more final webinar in the professional development series that's going to be next Thursday. It's going to start at 10 o'clock from 10 to 11, and it's on leadership development. So you can register for it on our site at bmtcoc.org. And we hope through all of these professional development webinars that they kind of all fit together and will help you accomplish your goals in business. And leadership development will be a fantastic one next Thursday. So again, get registered online, bmtcoc.org. And as a side note, and kind of off topic a little bit, in case you have not heard, we're not going to have a business connection online this Friday. We did our final Zoom meeting last Friday, but we'll be back live at the MCM Elegante and at a new start time, 8 o'clock instead of 7:30. So we'll hope maybe we can see you there. Looking forward to it. And you're more than welcome to attend anytime you feel up to it, maybe a couple extra free minutes in the morning. So thanks again, everyone, for being online. Craig, fantastic. Absolutely fantastic.
Thanks,
Best call
everyone.
I made all week.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank y'all. Have a good day.
Take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.